Test. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Traffic Corner Tuesday. My name is Paula Kerr, the Sales Director for CountingCars.com, and your host for today. Today's webinar will cover the top 6 ways to discredit a traffic study. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we dive in. You can listen to today's webinar from the convenience of the audio on your PC or mobile device. No call-in number is needed. Please join the conversation. Use the chat box on your screen to check questions or share your experiences through the presentation. We'll be circling back to the questions at the end of the presentation. The Traffic Corner Tuesday webinar series is brought to you by Mike on Traffic, which is part of SPAC Enterprise family of companies. SPAC Enterprise consists of a group of traffic engineering companies focused on helping you create healthy transportation systems and fix broken ones. Please mark your calendars for the upcoming webinars. On June 12th, 2018, we'll be doing professionally responding to citizens' complaints. And on July 17th, the intro to railroad quiet zones. Today's presenters are Mike Speck and Brian Fiesick. Mike is the creative force and principal writer for the industry-leading blog Mike on Traffic. He is a graduate of the University of Minnesota, past president of the North Central section of the Institute of Transportation Engineers, and a fellow of the Institute of Transportation Engineers. Since 1996, Mike has led over 1,000 traffic engineering projects. During the past 2 decades, Mike has founded several transportation-related companies, including SPAC Consulting, CountingCars.com, and Traffic Data Inc. Brian is the vice president of SPAC Consulting and widely known in the transportation industry, having managed more than 1,500 traffic engineering projects. He is a graduate of the University of Minnesota and an expert in Synchro, SimTraffic, Vistro, and vSim traffic modeling software packages. Brian thrives on developing creative solutions to traffic and transportation issues and enjoys writing case studies on unique projects on the Mike on Traffic blog. Mike and Brian will be taking away in just a second.
Yeah, bear with us, please. A little technical difficulty. Okay, so why don't we dive in? Thanks everyone for attending. And we will start in while they try to get our PowerPoint up. Hopefully you guys are hearing us. And so issue number 1 when picking apart a traffic study is related to the traffic counts. So we're going to cover 6 issues, but the traffic counts really are at the heart of the issue here as the foundational data. And the old traditional way is to get a 2-hour snapshot in the morning and the afternoon. And from there, then we layer on all of our traffic forecasting. But we're really based on a single data point, and anyone with a statistics background would question that. Right. And also question, are we actually getting, are we catching an anomaly on a day? Was there a parade around the corner?
Was it walk to school day?
So
lots of different things we could think of how a single day could be impacted when you're doing your counts out there. Not to mention the fact that, as Mike said, they usually took just the peaks. Are you sure you're capturing the peak? If you only counted from 7 to 9, what if the peak was 6:45 to 7:45, something like that?
Right.
So,
and then also another issue is seasonality. That if you're up in a resort community, is it fair to do traffic counts in March when the town is booming in July? So somehow all of that has to be factored in.
So that's our item number one as we look at in just how to look at those counts, make sure you are accurately recording what you need, set that base. What we do for our studies is we take 48-hour turning movement counts now. And with those 48, we're able to cleanly identify when the peaks are, whether it's the traditional AM and PM commuter, whether it's a noon or something else. And then we're also able to average those counts out, which helps take some of that, that randomness out of it. So it gives us the average, allows us to have a better base for our counts.
So the second issue is related to the trip generation. And this is really one of the big issues in our industry. And we've talked about it in past webinars. ITE puts out the trip generation manual. Over in the UK, they have Tricks system as a competing. But here in the US, we do have a new trip generation manual, and it is sliced and diced in a lot more ways. The data is broken down, urban, suburban. They've really changed the multifamily around.
All good improvements.
All good improvements. But at the heart of the issues here is still a fundamental lack of data. That this is the trip generation manual is a very limited data set. Again, if a statistician was looking at this, when we get down, I mean, if it was relevant data, everything would have a high R-squared value. But almost none of the data has a high R-squared value. So and also we can't filter by how old the data is. There's still data in there from the 80s, 90s, which may or may not be relevant. Also, is it local? That we've done studies for putting a Walmart in a small town. And if you go by the trip generation manual, it appears everyone in that small town is going to come to Walmart. So there's some thinking that needs to go underneath that.
Yeah, so this is, again, as we look at our studies, we tend to fall on local data where we can. We collect our own trip generation. It reflects better for our driving trends and our habits, which are slightly different than the national numbers. And then also it is to just take that second and think about the numbers as well. Like Mike said, it's ridiculous to think that half the town is going to the Walmart, or they're all going to be going to the bank every day, things like that. So you got to think about where you're at and the context of those numbers before just using whatever the book says and moving on. So use some engineering judgment in that trip generation.
And look at the scatter plots of if you're an outlier, if you have a 1 million square foot office building, but most of the office buildings are 100,000 square feet, it is probably not reasonable to use the average rates. So more thought needs to be given, but a lot of traffic studies just quick slap in the average rate. So please look at that.
All right, next one on our list is the modal split. And so by this, we mean not just cars. Traffic studies obviously focus on cars, obviously focus on the roads and how people are driving through, but we don't often think about the modal split and how many people might ride the adjacent train, how many people are walking back and forth, how many people are biking. Now, obviously, this is more of an urban situation in rural towns that may not be as applicable, but it's something to think about, and it can kind of relates back to the trip generation. As you think about those vehicles coming in, can that be reduced? Is there a way to think that, hey, yes, a lot of people are using the light rail to get around, or the bus system, whatever it might be, and they're not just driving their car to and from the new place.
So, and key to this is we've done a bunch of research over the years, and you can go to Mike on Traffic to see the different studies. We've researched travel demand management plans. So we've looked at businesses that implement travel demand management plans and compare those to just the normal ITE rates of businesses that are not implementing TDMPs. And we have found that a company or a building, an office building with a TDMP generates about 30% less traffic than ITE trip generation rates would predict. And we're doing about 10% less peak parking demand. So those should be accounted for, and it's certainly a strategy a business can implement. Just came back from a public hearing last night where the business wanted to do a TDMP because traffic was the number one issue for their development, and they wanted to do everything they could to lower their traffic impact. So then next up, and the fourth way to pick apart a traffic study is digging into the pass-by, multi-use, internal trips, all of those rates, where they, in our interesting studies, right, the fun studies, the big, interesting commercial with lots of outlots, where we're actually getting into some alternatives analysis and coming up with mitigation, not just rubber stamping that it's going to work. They almost always include usually all three. Definitely. Pass by, multi-use, internal trips. But again, the ITE data set is very limited when it comes to these discounts. And a tough part is this is very expensive data to collect. There isn't an automated way to get out there and capture, did somebody go from the bank in the outlot into the target? So you need to have good views or you need to do in-person surveys. And in-person surveys are really time consuming.
Yeah. Now ITE does have some information on this, and that's what we fall back on a lot of times for our studies. But just like the trip generation, it needs to be thought about again. So if you look at the ITE data and it's telling you 30% is pass by, if we go back to kind of the Walmart study we've been talking about, if that's telling you there should be 300 cars of pass by and you have a road with 500 trips on it, that's probably not very realistic. No. So again, it's trying to put it back into context to say, let's think about the situation and how much can reasonably be applied and those numbers. Again, don't just start with the book numbers. Think about those percentages and what it actually means for the situation you're in.
Okay. And so the next one of everything we're talking about is really the one that probably should be scrutinized the most and often is scrutinized the least. Yeah. It's the trip distribution pattern of how are people going to get in and out of the development. And there's, of course, we can apply regional model thinking, but that's rarely done. We can look at, if it is a Target store, go to Google and search the other big boxes in the region to see, oh, there's no competition off to the southeast. So maybe the distribution pattern leans that way. If you're working with a school or a church, maybe you can get the zip codes of the pupils or the congregants to try to develop distribution patterns.
And there have been a couple schools where we've looked at a proposed new elementary or elementary school, and it is on the edge of their district. And so if they are restricted to going within their district, you can pretty much assume that most people will be coming from one side since it's on the edge. So that was something we took into account in that trip distribution rather than just a standard even spread all over the place.
Yeah. So, but this is the magic crystal ball area of the traffic study and really should be discussed, and the government agency folks reviewing should think about it, especially if your consultant is kind of out of town, but you're living and breathing with the ecosystem within the city. You probably have a better sense of the traffic patterns and the distribution.
Now, there are some interesting technologies coming on that could help us in the future. Streetlight data. Some other ones, they're starting to use cell phone information to aggregate it to let you know where people are coming from.
Yep. AirSage has been leading the way with this.
Yep. So those they look promising. The problem right now is the expense, and you will spend more trying to get that data than you are likely charging for the study. So it's just not cost effective at this time.
Yeah, many of these studies are less than 10,000, and often it costs more than 10,000 to dip your toe into the data streams that are being aggregated. So then number 6 is general background growth rates. And I've pulled open the chart here from Federal Highway Administration, and this is vehicle miles traveled in the United States over the last 30 years, with 2018 being on the right. So, of course, we all know through the recession, kind of 2007, 2010 timeframe, we took a dip
and backwards
and kind of flatlined and had the gyrations. But over the last 3 years, we've had pretty amazing growth rates in traffic kick back in. And really interesting, the slope of that line is matching up with the historical 2 to 3% growth that we saw before the Great Recession. But there are some issues. Most traffic studies just take a standard growth rate and say, okay, we need to forecast out 20 years, so we're going to slap on a 2% compounded growth rate on top of that. So we're just going to grow traffic 60% in every direction. Several issues with that. Of an area, the roads typically have low traffic when you're out in a rural area. Then it has a steep growth portion of the curve as the area develops, and then it flattens back out. So it's an S curve as traffic grows. If we can't take this 2% growth rate and apply it for the next 150 years. But if you talk to some in the industry, they would imply it would.
Right.
We are not going to 10x traffic growth rate over the next 200 years by applying a 2% growth rate.
Yep.
So that's one issue with growth rates. Another fundamental issue is when we look at traffic forecasts coming out of a city's comprehensive transportation plan, theoretically, if we're meeting the zoning, it's already assumed traffic is coming out of your parcel that you're studying. So if we slap on a growth rate and then we throw our forecasts on top of that, we're in essence double accounting for that development. That there is an argument, if we're just going to growth rate out the traffic on the neighboring arterials, that should be accounting for the growth coming out of our parcel. So that's another issue. And then another pitfall I see common is inexperienced traffic engineers will throw the growth rate onto the driveway counts coming into a development, where once the development is in, that is accounted for with the trip generation. That's accounting for a successful, fully occupied building development. So that is not going to keep growing 2%. It's not that the Home Depot can double its traffic in the next 10 years by magically just being there. It has a certain capacity.
A similar thought could be applied to contain neighborhoods that are fully developed or other areas. I mean, there are some roads that are they're tapped out. There's nothing else that's going to go through there. So your growth should really be looking at what are the collector roads and higher functionality that's where the growth will occur, not some of the local roads that are already developed.
Right. So those growth rates to do the accounting probably most accurately should be applied to the through volumes on your collectors and arterials.
Yes.
And not the turning movement volumes, especially off of local roads and in and out of the development.
Yep. All right. Now we're into bonus material, 6.5.
Well, as we were going through this, we did come up with this extra one. And this gets into, we scope out our traffic study, and then we do our traffic counts, then we do our forecasting, then we do our analysis. We rarely circle back and think through, did we actually scope out all the intersections that might be impacted? Or rarely do we go out there and watch traffic as part of the proposal process? And if there are a couple of close intersections, the one upstream may be affecting the downstream volumes. And we could be, if it's a signal, it could be starving the traffic at the downstream intersection. And if we change the signal timing to get better progression, all of a sudden we may have significantly more traffic there. So it's important that we take 3 steps back once we get the results, once we get the traffic counts in, once we do our observations, once we get the modeling done, to make sure we have actually accounted for all of the intersections that could have a reasonable impact on them.
And I would add to that too, once you're thinking about your distribution, if you have heavy growth in one direction and you didn't account for anything in that direction, well, you probably should have, because that's where a lot of traffic is going and you want to account for that impact. So again, it's just like we've been saying, taking that step back, getting that engineering and really applying some thought to what you're doing rather than just checking stuff off the box.
Okay. So those are our 6. Now let's get into what this means. And the title of our presentation is a little tongue-in-cheek, a little facetious, although we just had somebody contacting us asking specifically, can we discredit another engineer's study? And that is not our business. So we want to be clear, we do not ever go into our work trying to discredit a study or discredit another engineer. So there's multiple levels when we are reviewing other engineers' work. We always start out, when we assume that if they're PEs and especially PTOEs, that they are competent, that they are ethical, that they are doing good work. And we state that at the beginning of our reviewing memos often, that this is a well-regarded engineering firm, just to set the tone of these are credible people who have done the study.
Yes.
And then we will go through kind of these 6.5 check marks, and those are the buckets we look at when reviewing, and we'll come up with all of our comments. Maybe, okay, we would have changed the trip generation a little bit, or we would think about a different distribution pattern. And we come up with all of our notes related to each of these topics. And we even write them in our review memos of, well, if we were doing this study, we would do this a little bit differently. But then when we get into the conclusions, we take 3 steps backwards. And if all of the intersections are operating at level service B, and we're talking about a 3% difference in trip generation, or maybe a 5% shift in trip distribution, instead of forcing a complete redo of the traffic study, we can use our engineering judgment to hone in on the few items that might change the conclusions and recommendations.
Yeah. And that's the key part that I think we strive to look for is, as we look at these things, are the changes going to impact the recommendations? I mean, that's the purpose of the review. They want to make sure that what they're proposing in terms of recommendation, mitigation, all that stuff is reasonable and valid. And if our review looks at it and it's really not going to make a difference at the end, we will state that yeah, we have some differences of opinion on how 1 or 2 of these items might have gone, but we would expect the same outcome, and their mitigation recommendations seem reasonable.
But we have been on the other side of the table and had our studies reviewed with 3 to 4 pages of change this and change that and change that and change that. And then we make all of the changes and nothing has changed with the conclusions, the recommendations, the level of service grades don't even move. So we're trying to be above board and address what needs to be addressed. And we strongly recommend everyone else look through that lens.
Yes. And that's what we mean reviewing as a professional. You're not there to hack somebody up. You're there to really take a clear eye to it, to say, is what they're doing reasonable? Are their outcomes reasonable for what's being presented?
So since we had some technical difficulty at the beginning, maybe we should scroll back and just recap our 6 buckets and go back to the beginning. Please write these calendar dates down: June 12th, July 17th. That's us. Bucket number 1, the traffic counts. Make sure you're make sure your foundational data is good and defensible.
And we would argue collect more
Yeah.
rather than less.
Yes. Trip generation, really make sure that you're not just grabbing average rates and throwing it out there. Make sure you have good data to base these forecasts on. And it may mean needing to get out there and collect your own data.
Mhm.
And we share all of our data at tripgeneration.org. Please go look at our data sets too. Modal split, if you're getting into travel demand management plans, if you're in a LRT area, a lot of bikes, these are all things to account for in your forecasts. Again, another limited data set. Trip distribution, especially the local agencies. This is an area where you really should we think you should weigh in on more.
Yeah, this is a good spot to check in, talk about it, make sure you're all on the same page.
Background growth rates, be reasonable. And then the study area, once you get through your analysis, make sure you didn't miss anything. And then finally, really be professional. Don't be nitpicky. Really hone in on the things that matter.
If I may, I have a couple of questions and comments from people.
Okay,
Um,
let's get through 2 more slides, and then
Absolutely.
Paul's going to jump in with some questions. So we've put together through Mike on Traffic and SPAC Academy a lot of different training packages, and these are all electronic documents, but there's a mountain of examples and how we do things that I think address all of these issues. Typically, we charge $299 for that. Through the end of the month, we're going to knock it down to $199, and today only we're going to knock it all the way down to $99. So if you go to bit.ly/TIS for Traffic Impact Study and then Academy, that'll take you to the link on SPAC Academy, or you can just go to SPAC Academy and look for that complete training package. If you have any questions about how we do things, this will really hone in and help you train younger engineers to do traffic studies. June 12th, kind of as we're getting into springtime, lots of those calls from frustrated residents, and going all the way back to my days in Maple Grove, how we've set up systems to help cities thoroughly respond to citizen requests. We'll reframe them away from complaints. And now we'll turn it over to Paul for question and answer.
So Murdad had a couple of questions for you guys. First off was, what about diverted link trips?
So diverted link trips, that gets into the pass-by, the internal, the multi-use. Diverted link, if your area is really small, though in the freeway interchange is 2 miles away, but that's not in your study area, but somebody's coming off of the freeway to come over to your Home Depot and then going back to the freeway. If your study area is too small, they're not going to show up. They're just new trips from the edge.
And that should then be accounted for in your trip distribution. It should be weighted heavier towards that interchange
Yes.
for your new trips.
So Murdad also had a follow-up to that. How do you decide which independent variable to use when doing TGen for commercial retail-oriented sites when they are similar out parcels with similar uses / competitors? So for example, several fast food restaurants in a single development site. Would you use GFA, PH, of adjacent streets? How would you do that?
We would typically fall back on the size of the building. So we typically use the square footage.
Yep.
That seems to be the best indicator.
That's the most robust data set is
Yeah.
usually under the square feet because it's the easiest for the collecting engineers to get that
Yeah, there's that too.
versus employees. But if we're looking at an office building, we may look at the number of employees. But a tricky part of that is they could be really understaffed, but later add more staff. So we think square footage is more consistent, if not honest. An area where we look different than that is usually with schools. We will look at students, but we will run the numbers multiple ways and see what the trip generation comes out like. And we will also kind of look at those ratios. If it's a school and the students, if we do the trip generation and that's an outlier looking at the data set, but the square footage looks to be in the middle of the scatter plot, we will probably go towards the square footage. At least
Yeah.
we'll have the discussion point of, hey, you're cramming a lot of students into this square footage, or we'll have different discussions to dig into that.
So not a clear-cut answer there, but it is something that we do look at, and just like everything else, try to apply some engineering thought to it. Where does it line up? What makes sense?
So then Rebecca has a comment/question. The ITE 10th edition online does have the ability to filter data by age and or by location. What are your thoughts on using the filtered data rather than a larger national data set?
I didn't think it was able to be filtered yet. I could be wrong. I haven't looked at it for a while. But if it is, I'm in favor of it. I like having the filtered data better. It's going to be more accurate in my view. Caveat to that would be the size. If you filter it and you're down to 1 or 2 studies, that would not be as accurate in my mind. So
Right.
you gotta think about it from that side of things.
Yeah, and maybe she's talking about the Otis system,
That could be.
not the
That's a step
ITE
up, yeah.
system. But we are concerned a lot of the older data points don't have all of that referential data. So if you start filtering, it's a small data set to begin with, in our opinion. And doing more
Right.
filtering, at some point, you're just really not statistically valid anymore.
So I'm going to jump ahead to another question here because people
Yep.
were saying, hey,
Yeah.
we all have the same here. How are the intersections being impacted selected? What is a good rule of thumb that maybe can be used, if any?
Okay, that gets in our complete package. We reference back we wrote a book on how to do traffic studies, and we reference back to ITE has a manual, a guidance on doing traffic studies, and it's based on the trip generation coming in and out of the site. The bigger the trip generation, the bigger the development, the further out you should look. And there's a whole matrix of how big is the trip generation out of the development versus how far out do you have to look.
Yes.
Obviously, for a Mall of America or an NFL stadium, you're looking out a couple of miles and looking at interchanges, freeway interchanges. If you're looking at a 50-unit senior housing building, you're looking at the driveway. So,
And maybe not even that, because the trip generation is so low, you may just need to say, here it is. Here's the trip generation.
and there's no way it has an impact.
Right.
And to the credit of ITE, the guidance in there is if it's less than 100 trips in the peak hour,
Yep.
That's a gray line that says under that, you don't need a traffic study at all. We would still want you to look at sight lines and think about the trip generation. There are reasons you may want to look at doing level of service analysis for a smaller development, but that is a rule of thumb to apply.
Okay. Do you have time for a couple more?
Yeah, it's 1:00. Please stay with us if you want, but also understand if time is tight. And again, sorry about the technical difficulties. We will be sending out the video again, so check on that. And if you all feel that this was a pretty poor performance, we can run it again and send out that recording with the PowerPoint if you guys felt like a lot was lost in this. So please leave that as feedback too. Want to know if we should redo this one.
Okay. Yes, please. So Craig asks, how do you justify the cost of collection for 48 hours for turning movement counts? The cost for data collection already makes up 20 to 30% of the fees typically.
Yeah, well, our experience here, I started Traffic Data Inc., a data collection company back in 2001. And the price we charge now for a 48-hour turning movement count is less than what I used to charge for a 3-hour AM and 3-hour PM count at a big suburban intersection where I had to put a couple of people. So things have changed a lot. Prices have come down. So as prices come down, as the technology gets better, we just feel like some of that money should go. The underlying data is such an important part of your analysis that you're going to say, I'm going to spend 80% of my budget on doing analysis on top of a shaky foundation. I'm not, that line of reasoning doesn't quite square with me of you need to get enough data so you can stamp that as a professional engineer and say, yeah, there aren't holes in that. And data collection is getting cheaper. So as the industry changes towards that, maybe prices go up for these studies. But that's where I'm at.
And we've had success too, pointing out the value in having more counts. So my answer to it would be, first, check what you're using. How are you collecting your counts? There may be more inexpensive ways to do it. Our equipment, our equipment's awesome.
Yeah, I found
pat
it
on the back.
I founded countingcars.com for this specific reason, to provide better equipment, better processing, cheaper. And that has really taken off. So if you're still using a tally pad or a JMark count board,
there's better ways to do it. The second part of that is it can be a differentiator, even if you are more expensive. You can point that out. Look what I'm doing. I'm collecting more data for you. I'm starting with a better base. What I'm giving you is going to be better than my competitor.
Yep. And we just won a study for a city that pointed that out, that our competitors had less data in there, and they ended up going with us. And they said, well, we almost made them rebid it to match your data collection, but we knew they'd be more expensive adding that on. So we're just going with you. So that has been successful for us as consultants.
Regarding trip generation, some residential land uses have rates/equations based upon dwelling units versus occupied dwelling units. This is useful information, but how should a directional distribution be applied when it is not available for one of these conditions? Would it be fair to apply the distribution provided for one to the other?
I got lost in that.
Yeah, I'm a little, I think you're mixing up the term. I think the use of distribution is confusing us a little bit, but we tend to go with the dwelling units, not the occupied dwelling units. Getting back to the same logic of the office building, it's the square footage is a more normalized representation of what's happening with the development. And if we're looking at a hospital and it's beds versus occupied beds, well, let's do the study assuming they are fully booked out. Or a hotel, yes, they probably are never 100% booked, but we go towards just the dwelling units or the number of rooms or the square footage, not the occupied, because we want a normalized situation, even if a different operator or a different owner takes over.
Yeah, and that would be a point that somebody could easily come back to, is if you did it by occupied and you only assumed half were occupied, well, what happens when they're fully occupied? I mean, that's an easy next question for somebody to throw at you. And if you haven't done that, you're stuck.
Okay. Is it prudent to determine distribution after counts are done and you have some adjacent background information?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, we do our distribution after we get the counts in, because they inform what are normal patterns out there right now.
The key there is that they inform. It is not the sole basis for what we do, but we use it as part of what we look at.
This one's going to be more so for Mike. Before purchasing the traffic study package, is there an opportunity to find out the topics contained within the various documents? Are there a table of contents available that they can find?
There is some information on SPAC Academy, but no, it doesn't drill. If you poke around SPAC Academy, hopefully you can get all your questions answered of the different topics that are out there. So poke around.
It's all golden. We wrote it.
I assure you there is a mountain of useful information for $99.
Yeah, I don't think, I think you'll be very happy for that amount of money.
How do you determine modal split? Is it based observations only? Also, if there is heavy pedestrian or bicycles, how do you determine the LOS for those modals?
There's two questions in there. First one on the modal split. There is some information from ITE. We can usually start with that as a base, but yeah, a lot of it is based on that observation. Look around your site. Is there a regional trail that would cause bikes and walkers to have more influence in the development? Is there a train station right outside the door, or is it 4 blocks away? So all that in context can help adjust what ITE has as a base, but ultimately it is a judgment call and it's your estimate.
Yes, it's estimate. Texas Transportation Institute, I think University of California, different places have done some research around this, but it is a very nascent
Yeah.
area of our profession that we don't have a giant, robust data set.
Yes.
So it is estimating. And as far as level of service related to pedestrians and bicycles, you talk to any of the folks in those industries, they will rip to shreds the level of service methodologies in the highway capacity manual, but they don't have a better answer. So that's something we struggle with because we are going towards a default of addressing pedestrians and bicyclists and transit. We're trying to address all transportation in our impact studies, but those are areas where we don't have the volume to capacity ratios that we can easily rely back on. And also the software packages don't even implement these areas robustly yet. So hopefully this is coming, but we're not there yet.
Yeah.
Do you guys got time for a few more questions?
Yep. We'll hang
Excellent.
on as long as people need you.
All right. How would we address developers who want to study a much larger area than the trip trend would suggest is appropriate? I understand they want to show that they were extremely thorough, but they can also be very time consuming to review. Do you have a means of being able to handle that?
It's interesting. It's usually the other way around, where you propose something and they want to scale down your study. There's no harm in going beyond. It's just, I think I would have that conversation with them and point out that you're likely not to see any change. And
yeah, and as a reviewing agency, you can hone in on, if you're only concerned about 2 intersections, one, you can kind of choose to ignore a portion of the study. You have that right.
Yeah.
And also, we take great pride in writing a summary conclusion in our studies that we feel the mayor, the city council, my grandmother can read and understand, to try to hone in on what are the couple of key points. And if the consultants you're working with are not doing that, ask them for a summary to really boil it down to what are the issues here. Get it down to 1 page. We think that's key with our studies.
Yes.
And also get rid of the jargon. Make it so my grandmother can read them.
Okay, a couple more questions for you. They have seen different trip distribution patterns for different land uses. Any thoughts on this?
Again, I'm getting mixed up on using the term distribution patterns. I don't know what that means. So let's skip on if.
Okay.
Well, yeah, I mean, if they're talking about different trip gen for the same land use, I could see that, again, depending on the context, depending on the size of the developments, they might be a little different. But the distribution should be individual to the sites. So I would expect them to be different for different places.
Right. Okay.
What radius of a study, I'm going to go back up here. What radius of the study area do you think the road intersection should be carried out?
That circles back to how big is the development and what's the trip generation. Most of our studies, we kind of draw a half a mile radius around the development, and we'll look at the signals within a half a mile to a mile, and then key stop sign intersections a little bit closer. And of course, always the site driveways.
This is another key point too. You should be talking with the public agency who's going to be reviewing it. You can make, and I would say you should make recommendations on what you're going to study and then allow them to react to it. And they can expand or pull your study back based on that. So that's a step we always try to take at the beginning. So we confirm our intersections, make sure that they agree with what we're looking at.
Yeah, but if you base it on the ITE guidance that we use in our documents, and you draw a 1 mile radius, but there's a really troubled intersection the city knows about that's 5,400 feet away from from your development. You should study that
Right,
intersection.
right.
So this isn't a mathematical yes, no, bright orange line.
Correct.
Okay. Would it be reasonable to consider both AM and a PM trip distribution if the background counts are highly directional?
Yes. Yeah, I could see. Rarely would it be that far off.
It's more often that would happen where you have in a downtown area with one-way streets and they have to take different patterns to get to where they want to go. Usually what I would say is you start more generic, kind of just north, south, east, and west, you should be able to come up with some pattern that way. And then the individual routes to get to those different places.
So it's the kind of the cordon around your study area, those right at the edge of your cordon, north, south,
Yes.
east, or west. You're going to have 20% here, 40% there. But as they're routing in and out, as that they get closer to the development, yes, they may have to take a different one-way street to get there.
Yeah.
So that gets accounted for in the routing. But,
Yeah.
but it probably doesn't change the external distribution pattern.
Yeah. So I would say on that external distribution, that's pretty rare in my case that you would change it from one to the other.
Right. But you could end up with, sometimes we don't look at Saturdays or Sundays as much as we should. Sundays for church type uses, Saturdays for commercial retail, kind of over the lunch hour. I could see scenarios where maybe there is a different distribution pattern between a weekday and a Saturday, but
Yes, absolutely.
and also different distribution patterns if you have a multi-use development, if you have commercial retail versus office, the distribution patterns for each of those categories, those may be different.
Yes.
Do you know of any city with a whole city traffic model ever tried to get rid of a full-blown TSAs by just getting the trip gens from the consultant and fitting that into their model?
No, and I know of several cities who have implemented a Synchro or a Vistro model for the whole city, and it becomes very unwieldy
Yeah.
and rarely updated. And then the software gets updated in those models. They don't update for the newest version of the software. So I know of several unsuccessful case studies around that, but I don't know of any home run, wildly successful case studies around implementing a microscopic model for the whole city.
Yeah, I would agree.
How do you apportion impacts with multiple planned developments accessing at the same junction or corridor, typically 1,000 to 2,000 units?
That's typically here in our region for bigger study areas. There's an environmental document, the AUAR, area-wide urban alternative review. And that is supposed to be for looking at big areas like that and basically doing a holistic traffic study that then when individual developments come in, as long as their trip generation is below what was assumed, they don't have to do a traffic study. So a city can choose to do a bigger regional study and then come back and say, as long as your development fits in within the study assumptions, you don't have to do the study. And that kind of makes sure they're not double counting and that everything fits together.
It's also a way of financing improvements rather than just putting those on the last person who comes into the area. If you know what you need in the future, you can start planning for it and charging people as they come to that development. So it's at least around here, it's a good way to finance future improvements as well.
Hey, Mike, what would it cost to buy the required hardware and software to do the traffic counts that you guys are doing at the moment?
Yeah.
Say a example would be a 4-lane per approach and 4-legged intersection.
Yeah, so that would be get one of our $1,200 cameras and you can send in that video to Count Cloud and it's a couple $100 to get that count processed. So look at countingcars.com, reach out to our sales team, and Paul here will really hone in on kind of the ROI for you and help you make the decision is it a good fit for you or not? We believe we have great ROI for 80% of the folks out there, but there are kind of use cases where our equipment is not a good fit, and we're happy to help you figure that out.
Absolutely. Okay, long one for you from Yuri.
Okay.
The Specialty Retail Center use, the LUC 826, has been removed from the latest trip generation manual.
Yep.
Do you think it's reasonable to use the LUC 820 instead? The LUC 820 from the 10th edition seems to greatly overestimate trips compared to the previous from the 9th edition. Follow up to that, is there something else reasonable to the 10th edition that they should be using besides the LUC 820? I'm paraphrasing that question.
Right,
obviously.
right.
We have sometimes been using the 820. That's the shopping center.
That is the shopping center. So yes, that has been our fallback instead of the specialty use. But as part of that, they have tried to add in more land uses so that you don't have to fall into a generic specialty. There are fitness, there's a fitness land use, there's a donut shop, coffee shop. So they
marijuana dispensary,
which
we collected the data for.
So I think that got removed based on what they figured they were adding. So rather than just a generic one, you now have lots of smaller specialty ones that you can try to fit in. Or like we said, the fallback is the shopping center, or the fallback to the fallback
is go collect some data.
Collect your own.
Yeah, your own baseline data.
And we've done that for a number of studies, even where it might fall into a correct land use, fast food store or something like that. We would go out and go to 2 or 3 of those spots in the area and use that as our basis.
Yep.
Okay. Would your training package follow the FDOT guidelines? And in addition to that, does it follow every state's training guidelines?
No. And I say that I say that because I don't know what every state's guidelines are. We have not researched that. I believe it reasonably fits with FDOT because I know Gary Sokolow and some of the other folks there, they actually got our permission. We're quoted several times, and they've pulled material out of our packages and put them into the FDOT guidance. So I'm pretty comfortable that our whole package here is complementary to the FDOT guidelines, based on we work closely with the Florida DOT.
It's close on some of the other ones, but you're going to have to compare and contrast. And
yes,
we have had to, when we worked in Indiana or other places, we've had to make some small adjustments. But I think more important is the process and the thought process that goes into each of the steps.
And part of that thought process in our traffic study manual we wrote, that's part of the package early in the stage, is talk to the local reviewing agencies and make sure you get your hands on what are the local policies and guidelines and governing documents. And I have some embarrassing case studies in there where I didn't do that, and that cost me. So
following that up, how do multi-uses areas impact generated traffic flows? Does it reduce traffic flow if in one walkable area there are living and working functions?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Complementary uses do get people out of cars. So, yeah.
If you are to analyze a roundabout in your report, how many directions of turning movements would you consider at least?
Well, you need all the legs of the intersection. So you need the full intersection. And another that leads to a plug on SPAC Academy. We have a spreadsheet that implements the highway capacity level of soft level service.
Yep.
If you don't have the full-blown Bistro or Synchro or highway capacity software, you can.
Yeah, it does your typical cases. It's not going to catch everyone, but if you have a standard 4-legged roundabout,
3 or 4 legged,
you can easily plug volumes in, and it'll kick out all the level of service you need.
But it's you have to have all the movements because it's based on the conflicts within the roundabout.
Correct.
What's the difference between pass by versus diverted?
Pass by would be the roads directly adjacent to a development. Diverted would be a nearby highway or freeway where people are coming off that freeway and then making use of local roads to get to the development.
And then they go back out to the freeway and continue on in the direction of the
Yes.
freeway. But on a pass by, they pull into the if they're going southbound on University, pull into the gas station. When they leave, they continue on southbound on University.
Yep.
So diverted trips, if you look like new trips, if your study area doesn't go out to the freeway.
Yes.
Hey, I think you guys will be right in this alley. Do you know the land use studies for marijuana cultivation facilities?
Yes.
I didn't follow the question, but Brian said yes. Go ahead.
So
Well, is there a follow-up to that?
no,
or
but
they
just do you know
asking-
of land use studies for marijuana cultivation facilities?
Well, we did trip generation.
We did it for the
studies.
distribution center, but not, so we did it for the retail stores. I think what they're asking for is more the greenhouse farm.
Oh, okay. I
And-
misunderstood.
And I've been asked that before, and we don't have data on that. So that's more of a farm use, which I think would be if they don't have a retail component, if they're not selling it like corn out of the back of the pickup truck, I assume they don't have high traffic at the cultivation center.
Fair. One of our international viewers asks, is it possible to use trip generation handbooks, et cetera, and materials which are made in the U.S. in other countries where the automobile level is different? If yes, are there some formulas to make the correlations?
Yeah, it's based on US. So unfortunately, and it's not going to be directly applicable. It's going to be more of the thought process and then taking that and applying to your local standards. So it's not going to be a one-to-one fit.
No, and there are no kind of correction factors to apply for different countries or correlation factors. It is very much US data. Now, some of it may apply and it's better than just totally guessing. But the manual itself says get local data. Getting local current data is almost always best. And using this data set is a fallback. So we're almost on 1:30. So why don't we take one or two more questions and wrap up at 1:30? And kind of sounds like maybe we should do a follow-up type.
Yeah, we may have to do an encore.
Yeah, figure out a little bit twist on this topic and do a follow-up.
Is it valid to use urban land use design guides for baseball stadium parking lot demand, as ITE does not provide any data for baseball stadiums? To follow up to that, the guide they used was the Urban Land Institute Parking Manual.
It seems like a decent resource. The times we have worked on stadiums, we have gone away from any trip generation and standards like that. We've more focused on what is the capacity of the stadium and then trying to hone in through the characteristics. How many people do we think are going to be coming in the peak hour? What is the occupancy per vehicle? What's the modal split? It's a really full process to go through rather than just grabbing a rate off the shelf.
Yeah, we do that a lot for any of our event planning, whether it's a corn maze right before Halloween or a stadium or an amphitheater in between. That's looking at the distribution of how early we think people will get there and then how many people per car. So if it's a 10,000 person amphitheater and we think 2 people per car, well, that's 5,000 cars showing up. But if they're by a light rail line and we think a quarter of the people are going to be able to use light rail, and of course, these are all assumptions, but we think the local characteristics and going through that thought process gets to a more defensible number than just taking an off the shelf number from 10 states away.
Yeah.
And final question, do you provide PDH hour credit for this training?
We do not yet, and it's something that is routinely asked. You can self-report, of course, with your local board. We would love feedback. We're doing this for free, and we like doing it, but there are no complete, easy, off-the-shelf systems for us to do a quick test and PDH. So it would cost us maybe $10,000 to build out that system. So then the question is, are you willing to give us $20 to be able to get the PDH for this hour? And we would love that feedback of if there's,
Yeah,
and
that'd
I'm
be
not even
great.
looking to make money on this, but if we could get close
we
to
could break
break even,
Yeah.
we may consider providing PDHs. So please leave feedback in the chat if you think that would be valuable.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank both Brian and Mike for conducting this webinar. We will be putting this up on the YouTube page, as well as thank you for bearing with us during the problems that we had. Just remember that at the bit.ly /TIS Academy is down to the $99. I do want to thank everyone that's already gone out during this webinar and purchased.
Yeah, it looks like we got a dozen people who've already bought it. So thank you.
Yeah, very much.
And again, if you have follow-up questions, we can always, you can take care of that. You can just email the events at SPAC Consulting, where the email that hosts us, if you didn't get to some of your questions. And so thank you again for everyone attending and staying very late with us today.
Yep.
And enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.